There used to be 3 of us, myself and my 2 older brothers, Christian and David. We used to spend most of our time together, just messing around and pissing each other off like most brothers would. And despite being a bully, Christian was the oldest and the most mature of the 3 of us. He would always take the fall when we would get into trouble, although he was also the one who taught us how to break the rules without getting caught. During this time, we used to stay out late doing stupid things. We would often sneak out through David's window and stay in the arcade until it closed. David was a bit different from us. He had an eccentric taste for weird and creepy things, while myself, I was just about video games. Honestly, we wouldn't have been close if it wasn't for Christian. Our eldest was a happy-go-lucky individual who usually joked about everything, good or bad. David and I would watch our brother race with his motorbike. It was pretty good at it, but it wasn't enough to save him from the accident that happened. Our eldest brother was hit by a pickup truck while he and his friends were racing on the main street. He flew off his bike when he was violently hit on the road. Christian struggled to get away from the vehicle that was approaching with a great speed, but unfortunately, his knee was bent backwards when he landed, and he failed to get away in time. It was quite a traumatic sight to see how our brother got ran over by the truck. We both saw how it happened while we were in the back seat of one of his friend's car. We saw how his body brutally twisted and turned as he helplessly went under the vehicle. His arms and legs were severely broken, as his shredded clothes were covered in blood. Now, this unfortunate incident had severed the relationship of our parents. My father blamed my mother for not being able to look after us properly while he was at work, although we were well aware that it wasn't the case. Aside from my parents' relationship, David and I also began to drift apart. Without our eldest brother to lead us on, we stopped spending time with each other and started to have our own means of coping with the situation that we had. We never really had any similar interests from the start, so there was no reason for us to even talk to each other. Aside from that, I didn't realize how close he was to Christian until we lost him. Out of all of us, it seemed that David was the most devastated for our brother's death. He was emotionally detached from our parents, and he had no other close friends then. He must have felt like our eldest brother was all he had. A couple of years after Christian's death, David started to change. It all happened when I was in my 2nd year of high school, and David started going to college. I was old enough to know what was going on, but I was too young to do anything about it. My parents were often aloof, as if they no longer cared about the things around them. If they would speak to each other, it would often lead to a quarrel, and old topics would be brought up, especially the things about Christian. I remained as a stuck-up kid who did nothing else but play video games. I guess it was my way of coping with the unhealthy relationships around me that were just gradually getting worse with each passing day. As for David, I could say that his social life improved since he started to go out with his new circle of friends quite a lot. And despite of living under the same roof, David and I rarely saw each other. He would lock himself inside his room whenever he was at home, which he rarely was. David finally broke out of his shell and behaved somewhat rebelliously. It might not have been the best time to lash out since he should be thinking of his future career, but at least he finally started to express his thoughts. He was a very secluded introvert before, so I thought it was sort of progress at that point. He would often talk back quite aggressively whenever Mom or Dad would question his activities after school, and how he was missing some of his classes. He also started to grow his hair long and colored his nails black. David also acquired a few tattoos of what looked like occult symbols, and the number of his face piercings increased dramatically. Aside from this sudden change in behavior and appearance, our parents didn't approve of his new acquaintances, although it seemed that they didn't really care about it much since, well, they did nothing when David refused to listen. His friends were quite a peculiar bunch. They were pretty interesting individuals who were confident to show some edgy style and unpopular taste. I mean, they were all fine arts students of a progressive school anyway, so I already expected that. While some of them seemed like properly dressed and well-mannered college students, there were a mix of metalheads, goths, and straight-out creepy dudes among them. But despite of their differences in character, there was one thing I noticed that all of them had. They were all carrying some kind of insignia. Some were wearing it as pendants and charms, while some had it stamped on their notebooks and bags. I thought it must have been a label or a logo for some kind of fraternity that David had joined, since he had it on his bracelet as well. They would often play loud music and sometimes drink while hanging around the yard whenever Dad wasn't around. Mom seemed upset about it, but she chose to just ignore what was happening. For me, I kind of liked it. At least the house became somewhat lively from time to time. They were quite a rowdy bunch aside from weird, but they seemed harmless to me. I just kept my distance at first and chose to observe, although some of them would sometimes talk to me and borrow some of my games. But David wasn't one of them. The one who talked to me the most was Dan. He was a huge game nerd, despite of the huge skull tattoos on his arms and violet mohawk. After a few months, I noticed that they got fewer. There were 12 people who would show up at our house to hang out with David at the beginning, but then there was only 8 of them. I could also tell that the ones who stopped showing up were the noisiest of the bunch, since it became quiet around the house once again, even if they were there. They gradually grew serious. Despite of being college students, I didn't see them read any books up until that point. They were all sharing a book that looked really old, and some printouts as well, which I assume were just copies of some of the pages of the same book. And I got really curious, so I kept on walking by as they were reading on the porch. The leaves of the book were already coppery brown, and it looked really fragile. I saw some of the symbols and diagrams in it, but I wasn't able to look long enough that I could read it. When they noticed I was peeking inside the book as I walked by, David immediately closed it and told me to go away. When he closed the book, I saw on the cover that there was an engraved print of the same insignia that they all carried with them. I grew even more curious when I discovered that their symbol came from that old book. I wanted to ask them about it, but it was pretty obvious that they wouldn't tell me. I was just a kid that was meddling with the interest of young adults anyway. As the time passed, they got even fewer and fewer. From 8 remaining individuals, it gradually went down to 3. They no longer went out on the yard, nor entered the house through the door. Since there was just a few of them, they preferred to stay inside David's room by entering through his window. The time of their visits also changed. I would hear voices and footsteps for as late as 3 in the morning. They used to invite me in before just to chatter for a few minutes, mainly by Dan, until I questioned the candle droppings on the floor and the weird scent of some kind of herbal incense. At first, I thought they were just smoking weed, or maybe meth, but Dan just laughed at me. Aside from that, there was a spot on David's wall that was covered by a black veil. It was where the smell of incense was coming from. I then realized that David didn't just join a typical kind of fraternity. With the old book that looked like a grimoire, the dropping of black candle wax on the floor, and the covered spot on the wall that looked like an altar, it seemed that David was a member of a cult. No, I usually don't watch TV, I couldn't care less about the shows or recent events, but the pictures I saw that flashed on the screen one day immediately caught my attention. It was the news about individuals that were reported missing. Coincidentally, some of them were pretty familiar to me. The pictures were mostly headshots of college students, and I became certain with my guess when they mentioned the school. I didn't recognize them at first because they usually had thick eyeliner and all that, but some of the missing people were the ones who used to visit David. They were those who just suddenly stopped coming to our home. I ran to David's room so I could ask him about it. I just opened the door and without knocking, and it was then that I saw something strange. One of his friends was standing in front of the mirror putting contact lenses in. He looked at me when I just barged inside the room before he was able to insert one of the contacts, and I saw that his eyes were extremely dilated and that it looked unnatural. Aside from him, the other one sitting on the bed was peeling a layer of his skin whole, as if she was shedding like a lizard. When I saw that, I also remembered that Dan's tattoos looked significantly faded when I had last saw it, compared to the first time he showed them to me. David got really pissed, and he shoved me back out and then slammed the door shut. I wasn't able to tell him what I was supposed to ask, but I noticed one thing aside from the weird stuff that were going on inside of his room. Dan wasn't there. I had no idea what the hell was going on, but it was obviously something that they didn't want anybody to see. Since that day, Dan stopped showing up as well. Without Dan, I could no longer go inside his room since his door remained locked at all times. He also stopped joining us at the dinner table during our meals. The only time we got to see him was when he would leave the house. We wouldn't even know when he got back since he would sneak through the window of his room. He would always wear a hooded long-sleeved jacket and shades. He talked even less compared to the times that he was barely talking to us. It was pretty obvious that he was trying to cover himself. The only skin I would see on his body were his hands and a part of his face, and I noticed that there were peels of dry skin on them, like the ones I saw on his friends. David was changing. A few weeks later, I was awakened by a loud sound coming from downstairs. Mom and Dad were having the worst fight they ever had. Plates and glasses were being shattered as my mom were throwing it at my dad. Apparently, he was having a romantic relationship with one of his coworkers. Mom was so mad that she was screaming at the top of her lungs. Dad was trying to reason with her, but his efforts were futile. I couldn't do anything either. I was even almost hit by a flying plate. I ran upstairs and knocked on David's room, thinking that maybe he could stop the fight. He wasn't opening the door. I thought he probably had his headphones in like he usually did, so I started banging harder. Yet there was still no response. I decided to walk out of the house and climb up to reach his window. My parents' fight was getting worse, and it needed to be stopped before Dad decided to retaliate. And when I reached the window of David's room, I took a peek inside before I opened it. I was baffled and creeped out with what I saw. David's shirt was off as he was standing in front of the mirror. He was peeling off his skin, and it was being replaced by a pale gray snake-like scales underneath. Like I assumed, his irises were also extremely dilated. That's why he couldn't remove his shades. I was too scared to talk to him and I just wanted to climb back down, but it seemed he already knew I was there before I even made a sound. My senses are heightened by now, brother. You can't sneak up on me, he said. Even his voice changed. It became deeper and raspy. I could barely recognize him anymore. I reluctantly asked what happened to him, and he started uttering a bunch of nonsense. He proudly told me that he evolved, that he managed to rid himself of the physical weakness of a human, and that he would keep on changing until he was completely clean from the flaws of men. He sounded like a madman as he struggled to talk with his teeth changing into fangs. I was undeniably frightened of his appearance, but I also felt bad for my brother. Due to this drastic change, I knew what would happen next. I told him that our parents were having the fight of their life, and that I was afraid that father might lay a hand on my mom when he finally lost his patience. David breathed calmly after hearing what I said, and then he suddenly jumped out of the window like it was nothing. He literally lifted off like a cat and landed on the ground quite effortlessly and quietly. As I saw him walking towards our front door, I immediately went down to see what he was about to do. Just in the nick of time, my dad had raised his fist and was about to hit my mother when I arrived. His hand was raised and he was about to swing it when David stepped in. When they finally saw what he looked like, my mom screamed. My dad tried to back away, but David was already holding his arm, and he was hissing at my dad's face like a snake that was about to take a bite. Like my first reaction when I saw him, they were both extremely horrified. David grabbed my father by the neck as my mother fell on the floor out of shock and paralyzing fear. He then lifted my dad from the ground, and with just one hand, he threw him away as if he were weightless. The throw was so great and powerful that my dad went through the wooden walls and landed outside on the porch. My mother screamed as my brother stared at her. David calmly walked out of the house as my dad was starting to spit blood on the floor. I tried to call him back, but he just turned his head for a second and went on ahead. That was the last time we saw my brother David. I always wondered what happened to him since then. My parents eventually got a divorce and my father moved out, and it seemed that the missing individuals on the news back then weren't exactly missing, but they chose not to go back home when they turned. Whatever group it was that my brother joined, it was no ordinary cult in any way. It might even be some kind of experiment that was only covered up by a mysticism and a cult. There were nights that I could hear some rustling in the bushes, and I would see a shadow of a man with long hair. I assumed it was David visiting us. I would always try to call out to him, but he would suddenly disappear in the shadows.